you certainly pull no punches. You don't hold back in your very fierce criticism of psychiatry, and I firmly believe that that's warranted, to criticize it fiercely. And one of the lines that you say, and you just actually said it a couple minutes ago, in the beginning of your book, is that psychiatry does vastly more harm than good. And you also say that you make a good point that there's this phrase, which is the phrase psychiatric survivor. And that kind of says it all, because
Yes.
there's no other medical specialty where we say we survived despite our exposure to seeing that type of doctor. Usually people
Yeah.
say I'm a cancer survivor, and that's thanks to medicine. But
Yeah.
no one, but psychiatric survivor, that it really does says it all. It means that I actually, endured and survived the harmful interventions that were prescribed to me. So let me start by asking you a general question, and then we'll get into the specifics. What do you see is, the main harm that is being done when you make a statement like psychiatry is more harmful than good? What types of harm are you talking about?
Well, let's start with the worst harms, mortality. It is pretty difficult to find out how many people are killed by psychiatric drugs every year, because the randomized trials where half of the patients get placebo, they ought to be the best documentation we have. But these trials are flawed. For example, half of all deaths and half of all suicides are simply missing. They are not published. So this is what we call fraud. And not only that, you construct these trials that you usually have people who are already in treatment, almost always. Then you have what you call a placebo washout period, where they don't get, for example, the depression pill they have been on for a long time. And then they are randomized to placebo or another depression pill. And then what happens is that some people become abstinent. They get horrible withdrawal symptoms when they no longer get their pill. And these symptoms increase the risk of suicide, violence, and even homicide. So you create an artificial increase in risk of dying in the placebo group, and therefore it becomes difficult to find out how lethal these drugs are. So to give you one example, the trials in schizophrenia are totally unreliable for this reason, that you introduce a pretty large death risk in the placebo group. So you are harming the patients. These trials are unethical, but that's how they are done. Then I thought, if I go to old people, then they likely did not get an antipsychotic, for example, before they were randomized to placebo and an antipsychotic. So then I looked at these trials, and then I could see that for every 100 people treated for a few weeks, 2 were killed by the drug compared to placebo. 2%. This is a very high death risk for any drug in medicine. So if you treat for a whole year, the death risk will be higher than 2%, of course. So I have tried to do my best. And in a book I published 6 years ago, I estimated that psychiatric drugs may be the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. And maybe I have exaggerated it a bit, but there is no doubt that these drugs kill a huge number of people. And if you turn to depression pills, which I never call antidepressants, because this suggests that they are effective towards depression, which they really aren't. We now know that these pills double the risk of suicide. We have known that for a long time they did so in children and adolescents. Now we know it's also a fact for adults. So why on earth do you treat depression where what we fear most is suicide with pills that double the risk of suicide? This tells you how bad current psychiatry is. My daughter, who studies psychology, and we have done a review of psychotherapy in people who were admitted acutely after a suicide attempt. So they were at high risk for a new suicide attempt. And what we found was that when they got psychotherapy compared to usual therapy, which does not mean that you turn your back on the patients, but you are kind to them and try to help them. But if you use psychotherapy, you actually halved the risk of a new suicide attempt. So we have psychological therapies that can halve the risk of a new suicide attempt. And we have pills that double the risk of suicide. And what do? We use pills and very little psychotherapy. This just tells you how incredibly awful this is. I just heard only today a new tragic case. I was contacted by a good friend whose friend's husband was depressed, and she wanted to get advice. And I told her to read my new book. Then she and her husband would realize that the worst thing he could do was to go and see a psychiatrist, because then he would likely come on pills. But unfortunately, people believe in authorities. So even though I want them, he went to a psychiatrist and he was put on pills, and he has just hanged himself. Of course, I don't know if it was the pills, but we know that they double the risk of suicide. And what is characteristic of these depression pills is that the suicide methods are usually violent. People hang themselves, they shoot themselves, they jump off bridges. Whereas if people normally try to kill themselves, it's with pills. They take too many pills of some kind, But what is characteristic of depression pill suicides is that the means people use are violent ones. They want to be sure that they succeed because they suffer terribly from the side effects of the pills, which can drive them into suicide.
And that's what I was going to ask you is why, what explains this? What exactly are the pills doing that increase the likelihood of suicide? And I'll just say one thing that I've heard explained from multiple sources, that one of the reasons that suicide increases once you start taking these drugs is that they generally suppress regions of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex, that inhibit certain actions. So a person, when their prefrontal cortex is not suppressed, might think, I'm just going to kill myself today. I'm going to shoot myself. But then there's this other impulse that inhibits that. There's a voice that says, no, I can't do that. There's all these people love me. I can't do that. But essentially that inhibiting mechanism of the brain that stops us from doing certain things is suppressed by depression pills. So go ahead, please elaborate on why else.
This is one of the many lies in psychiatry. This specialty is full of lies. I would characterize this explanation as pure bullshit. It is armchair reasoning, wishful thinking. This has never been documented. Whereas the real mechanism behind depression pill suicides has been documented. We know what it is. And it's not what you tell me. One of the adverse effects of depression pills is that it can make some people extremely restless. They develop something called akathisia. This is Greek for I cannot sit still. So people may wander frantically around and cannot sit still anywhere. They describe it, sometimes they want to jump out of their own body. And it's an absolutely horrible condition that increases the risk of suicide and violence dramatically. And the worst thing is that people don't realize it could be the pills. They think it's themselves that have become crazy. So they can see no other way out than to kill themselves. This is one very well documented mechanism, a side effect of the pills. Another effect of the pills is emotional blunting, that you care less about anything. You care less about yourself, you care less about your loved ones, which contradicts what you just told me, because then the person might not care that my mom and dad will be sorry if I kill myself. They just don't care, and they do it. So this is another mechanism. Then we have a third mechanism, that rarely people on depression pills can become psychotic. This can also drive people into suicide.
Mm. And I just want to say too, I remember reading in your book the terms that you suggest we start using for each of the different categories of these drugs. And I think we can go ahead and start using this terminology, and people who are listening and watching can be up to speed with us here. So instead of calling them antidepressants, you suggest we call them depression pills. It's more honest. It doesn't give this misleading suggestion that it goes against depression.